Okay, so on to the reproductive system. Hopefully you've had some biology. You understand the difference between meiosis and mitosis. But meiosis is the making of the eggs and the sperm. We need to decrease in half the number of chromosomes. So we end up having sex cells that have one set of genetic instructions because we do sexual reproduction, and we get one set from the mom and one set from the dad. All right, and at fertilization, when the two unite, that genetic information is restored and we get 46 chromosomes. So the egg has 23, the sperm has 23. And these are produced by a special division called meiosis. Now, I'm not going to go through meiosis because you should know this. If you haven't ever had meiosis, you might want to take a look at meiosis. But bottom line is you do have two different stages of it. You have meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, and you split it and you end up with yours. So go through these phases. If you don't know them, if you haven't had biology, spend the time and go through this. Okay? So let's start on the male reproductive system. The primary sex organs in the male are the testes, the testicles, and you do have these accessory sex organs that are either internal or external, and that are going to secrete the male sex hormones and to get the sperm transported out of the body and to the female. So you can see, look at this diagram. You're going to need to learn these for the lab, so just FYI. But you can see the testes here, and the sperm is produced here, and it goes here in the epididymis to mature, and then gets moved out here during ejaculation. The testes actually originate behind the parietal peritoneum near the kidneys. And usually about 1 to 2 months before birth, testosterone gets secreted and it triggers the descent into the scrotum. And there is a fibrous cord that helps these move down. Sometimes they don't completely move down, but after they have moved down, the spermatic cord contains the ductus deferens, or more commonly called the vas deferens, the blood vessels and the nerves. And we're going to look at that in the pig. I brought in this picture of this baby, and you can see there's one testicle that did not descend. So if they don't descend, and this happens in dogs and cats and stuff like that, that can cause infertility. And we'll talk about that because the sperm need to be cool, and they're put in this scrotum to regulate the temperature. Okay, so if we look at the testes, you've got these lobules, and you have these seminiferous tubules. These are highly coiled tubules. They are lined with a stratified epithelium that contains these cells that are going to be making the sperm. And you also have interstitial cells. They're called Leydig cells, and they lay within those tubules, and they produce the male sex hormones. Okay. You have a channel that transports the sperm from the testes to the epididymis, the ret testes, and the epididymis is a coiled tube. It's very long on the surface of the testes, and basically that's where the sperm are going to go to mature after they've been made. So you can see these lovely little pieces. And if you take a diagram and look at it, you can see the sperm here. So they basically start here, and as they mature, they go into here, and they start to begin to look like sperm. So Some of the internal accessory organs consist, you can see the list of these. We're going to go through these. The epididymis is, again, this coiled tube. It is connected to the ducts in the testes. And basically it promotes, again, the maturation of the sperm cells. This is lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelium with non-motile cilia. But basically the sperm get produced in the testes and then move through the tube and sit in the epididymis and mature. They have to get enough sugar, they have to mature, they have to get motility of their tails and that sort of thing, and then so they'll sit in the epididymis to mature. Connected to that is the vas deferens, and this is part of the spermatic cord, and it is also lined with your pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and this is basically a duct that, again, the sperm move out of. All right, so you have that vas deferens that connects it, and we'll show you where it wraps in. You have a couple glands. You have the seminal vesicles. These are attached to the vas deferens near the base of the bladder, and they secrete an alkaline fluid which regulates the pH in the male and female tracts. Okay. It also secretes fructose for energy. And the contents empty into what's called the ejaculatory duct, and this is what this is most of the volume of the semen. You also have the prostate gland. Again, in the male, we're going to take a look at that. That's going to surround the, basically the upper portion of the urethra. And these ducts open into the urethra, and it secretes a thin, milky, alkaline fluid, and this enhances sperm motility. You also have the bulbourethral glands, also called Cowper's glands. Females have this. This secretes a mucus-like fluid into the urethra, and this fluid is released in response to sexual stimulation, and that's that drop that you see at the end of the penis, and that is for lubrication. All right, so if you take a look at the semen itself, each ejaculation is about 2 to 5 mLs. You want to see a slightly alkaline pH, and we'll talk about this, but the reason for this is the female's vaginal tract is acidic to protect the female. And so it's to buffer out the female's acid. Basically, the sperm begin to swim as they mix with these secretions. And again, you've got about 2 to 5 mLs. When you do a sperm analysis, what is done is you look at this, you look at the amount of liquid that's been ejaculated. You also want to analyze the sperm itself. You want to see a sperm with a single head, a single tail, and so that they will be looked at to make sure that they are properly developed. The sperm cannot go through, cannot fertilize an egg until they go through what is called capacitation in the female tract, which weakens the cap over the sperm. And let me go back and just show you this. In terms of this, you can see this, there's a little cap there. We'll get into looking at that a little bit later on. But it's got to be, basically, there are enzymes released on there. For the external, you have the scrotum and you have the penis. The scrotum is the pouch. And again, the whole idea is to get these testes away from the body. The sperm don't like to be warm, and they don't like to be cold. So basically that scrotum has muscles that respond to the temperature changes and keep the testes at the optimal temperature for sperm production and sperm survival. Again, about 5 degrees below body temperature. So the sperm don't like it. That's why if you have undescended testicles, those sperm that are going to be produced in there are not going to be fertile because they're too hot. The penis itself, you have a body or a shaft that has these columns of erectile tissue. The glans penis is the enlargement at the end, and then you have the foreskin that covers that penis. And again, if you get circumcised, that is removed. When we talk about erection, basically what happens is during the stimulation, there is a nerve, a parasympathetic nerve, that it releases nitrous oxide, which dilates the arteries of the penis, and the pressure of that arterial blood compresses the veins just because of the structure of that area, and so blood accumulates in those tissues, and the penis swells. And then when orgasm occurs, or doesn't, and kind of releases, the orgasm itself, emission is the movement of the semen into the urethra itself, so out the vas deferens and down into the ejaculatory duct. Ejaculation is the movement of the semen out of the urethra itself, and this is dependent upon sympathetic nerve impulses. And then basically once that occurs, that drops the pressure in this arterial blood, and that allows the penis to go back to normal. In terms of forming sperm, you have Sertoli cells. These are large cells. They go through the entire thickness of that seminiferous tubule, and it's going to nourish and support those cells. And you can see the formation. You start with a basically kind of like a blast cell, but it's a spermatogonia, and you get a primary spermatocyte, a secondary spermatocyte, spermatids, and then finally the spermatozoa. And then again, the meiosis reduces that number, so each sperm should have 23. So spermiogenesis is the development of those sperm, and when each spermatocyte, you get 4 sperm. This is different than in the female, so just realize that. For every primary spermatocyte that you have, you will get 4 sperm, okay? And so you can look at the chromosome number is 23, and you can basically end up with 4 sperm with 23 chromosomes. During spermatogenesis, the cells will replenish themselves and again will give rise to these spermatocytes. And as these stages go through and the sperm starts developing, the sperm migrate from the outer edge of that seminiferous tubule to the inner, like I showed you. And then they're going to move on into the epididymis. And you can see here, they're going to start here, and they're just going to move out, move out, move out, and finally end up here. All right? So when you look at the sperm, it does look like a little tiny tadpole, but you've got the head, and that's where the chromosomes are. And you have the cap that we mentioned about, the chromosome. This contains enzymes that can penetrate the layers around the egg during fertilization, because basically the sperm have to hit the egg and start to release those enzymes so that they can get in the egg. There is a midpiece or a body that has mitochondria, which provides ATP for the swimming, for the tail movement, and then you have the tail, and that is basically that's an extension of that mid-piece, and you have microtubules that are there, and that provides that lashing movement. In terms of getting these hormones produced, It is controlled. These hormones are produced by controlled by the hypothalamus. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, if you guys remember, gonadotropin inhibiting hormone. And then you get those hormones released. So these hormones are going to initiate and maintain the sperm cell and oversee the development and maintenance of the secondary sex characteristics that we associate with a male. So in the hypothalamus, again, this gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to regulate the secretion of gonadotropins from the anterior pituitary. And those are going to be, for the male, follicle stimulating hormone. And that is going to stimulate the cells of the testes to mature and to respond to testosterone. And then you're going to have luteinizing hormone, but in a male, we generally call this interstitial cell stimulating hormone, and that actually causes the development of the interstitial cells in the testes, which secrete testosterone. And so in the presence of FSH and testosterone, the cells stimulate spermatogenesis to occur. Now again, with a male, this is going to basically occur once they reach puberty their entire lives. There is a negative feedback control. The testosterone, other androgens will prevent the oversecretion of gonadotropin releasing hormone and the luteinizing hormone. And you may have inhibin secreted, which prevents oversecretion of FSH, so you can turn it on and off. Testosterone is the most important androgen, and these androgens are the male sex hormones. And secretion, again, begins during fetal development and continues until several weeks after birth, and then secretion nearly stops during childhood and then starts again during puberty. But that testosterone has to be secreted in order for the baby to develop into a male. Then you get, you have a derivative of that, dihydrotestosterone, DHT, and that acts on your accessory organs. So prior to birth, you get the development of the male reproductive organs and the descent of the testes into the scrotum. During puberty, you get enlargement of the testes and the accessory organs. You get the normal development of secondary sex characteristics that you considered: the growth of body hair, enlargement of the larynx, the lowering of the voice, the increased muscular muscles, the thickening, strengthening of bone, the increased rate of red blood cell production, cellular metabolism, that sort of thing. It's all because of testosterone. Okay, so when we look at the female, we have specialized functions of the female reproductive organs. This is if the female, because they've got to grow the baby, is a little more complicated than the male. But you're going to produce the female sex hormone, the sex cells, and then you have to transport the eggs to the site of fertilization. You have to provide an environment for that offspring to develop, and then you've got to go through labor and birth that baby and also produce sex hormones. So you have the primary sex organs are the ovaries. Those are the ones that are producing the eggs, and then you have the secondary accessory organs. All right, so your ovaries, and you can take a look at this. And again, as I mentioned, here's your bladder. The uterus sits on top of this. Most people don't have a tendency to realize that. So the ovaries lie in the lateral wall of the pelvic cavity. You have attached several big ligaments that hold them in place. Like the testes, the ovaries develop near the kidneys, and they descend to locations just inferior to the what we call the pelvic brim. And again, with the males, this descent through the abdominal cavity sets men up for hernias, little hernias. Females, not so much. It's interesting. You can get it, but not as much as the males. Now, where have we seen this before? In the cortex and a medulla. Yep. So you have the inner layers, the medulla. This is lymphatic vessels, blood vessels. The cortex has follicles in it, these ovarian follicles, and these oocytes will develop inside these follicles. So we have primary follicles, and these females are very interesting in terms of how this is done. This is totally different than males. So prenatally, these follicles will develop, and the primordial germ cells, oogonia, we pronounce the two O's together, oogonia develop into what we call the primary oocytes. And each of the oocytes is surrounded by epithelial cells called follicular cells, and that the oocyte surrounded by the follicular cells is called the primordial follicle. And early in the fetal development, the primary oocytes begin the process of meiosis, but they don't complete it. Okay, so it just begins the first stages of meiosis and stops. Once the primordial follicles are produced, no new ones are produced. So unlike the male, the female is born with all the follicles she's ever going to have. So the number of oocytes continues to decline through the life, and about 90% of the primordial follicles are present at birth are lost to what we call apoptosis, programmed cell death between birth and early adulthood. But unlike the male that's going to produce sperm once he reaches puberty all his life, females are born with all the eggs they're ever going to have, okay? And about 300 to 400 oocytes are released from the ovary during a female's life. Okay, so we start looking at the accessory organs. We are talking about, first of all, the uterine tubes, frequently called fallopian tubes or oviducts. We'll talk about this. This is a little different in humans versus pigs and cats and dogs. The uterine tubes in the human is a transport area. We'll talk about this. It's the area of fertilization for us. It's where we want fertilization to occur, but we want the fertilized egg to embed in the uterus. In these other mammals, the pregnancy is actually in the uterine tube. They don't have their pregnancy in the uterus, so it gets to be interesting. Near the end of the ovary, there is a funnel-like structure. It's called the infundibulum, and it has extensions called the fimbriae, and the ovary is here, and the egg is released, and its job is to catch the egg and get the egg into that uterine tube, okay? So the mucosa is lined with cilia, and it helps transport the egg down the uterine tube via some peristaltic contractions. And again, fertilization, it's best to occur in that first 1/3 of that uterine tube. So you can see the ovary, you can see the fimbriae right here, and this is of the infundibulum. Okay, and you can see these huge ligaments. All right, so the uterus itself is hollow, it's pear-shaped. It is attached to the pelvic wall by these big ligaments. You have a dome-shaped fundus at the top. Again, that dome shape is a fundus. You have the body. You have the neck which is the lower 1/3, which is the cervix, which partially extends into the vaginal area. You have linings. You have the endometrium, which is the inner lining, the myometrium, which is the muscle. Anytime you see muscle, it's myo, and the perimetrium, which is the outside layer. Okay, so the vaginal area, this is a tube that runs between the uterus and the outside, and obviously it's going to convey uterine secretions. This is where the penis is introduced during sexual intercourse, and this is a passageway for the offspring to exit the body. The vaginal area has 3 layers. Again, this is a mucosal layer. This is stratified squamous epithelium. It has to be stratified because in sexual intercourse, there is friction, and if you didn't have those layers, you could have bleeding and tearing and that sort of thing. And then you have a muscle layer and a fibrous layer. Okay. The external organs are basically that you surround the opening of the urethra and the vaginal area, and it's called the vulva. And you have the labia, and these are just folds. And basically they are they provide a covering, a protection. They enclose the external reproductive organs, and they form like a hood over the clitoris. The clitoris in a female is analogous to the penis. It does have erectile tissue, and it comes from, in the development, the same area as the penis in the male. Okay, so just like the male, the erectile tissue in the clitoris and around the vaginal area will dilate due to nitrous oxide and expand the vaginal area, and it causes the vestibular glands to secrete mucus, which will lubricate this area to aid in sexual intercourse. And basically, if orgasm occurs, the muscles will contract rhythmically, which help to transport the sperm towards the uterine tube, because the whole idea is to have a baby to populate the species here. With oogenesis, this gets a little interesting. Again, you've only gone through a small portion. Actually, you go to a metaphase 1 as a fetus, and you stop. At puberty, some of the primary oocytes continue meiosis. Okay, so you'll have a few cells each month that mature, and when the primary oocyte divides, they form what's called a large secondary oocyte and what's called a first polar body. And again, this is very different from the male. And basically what we end up with is the polar bodies divide and stuff like that. The bottom line is male make 4 sperm. Females have 3 polar bodies, 1 functional egg. All right, so the secondary oocyte, that is the future egg cell, has to be fertilized by the sperm in the future, and that secondary oocyte undergoes, it has completed meiosis 1, it undergoes meiosis 2, stops, and does not complete meiosis 2 until it is fertilized. Okay, and so this is totally different from the male, and this is why the age of the female can really cause problems in terms of chromosome abnormalities in the baby, because as the mother gets older and older and older, the chances of something going wrong, because you've done part of the division as a fetus and some of the division as you get ready to, the egg gets ready to be released, and it may have sat there for how many years, 30, 40 years, and then finally, when it gets fertilized, it finishes meiosis. Interesting. So at puberty, the anterior pituitary gland secretes a huge amount of FSH, and the ovaries enlarge. And again, these follicles mature into what we call primary follicles, and that oocyte enlarges, and they proliferate into several layers of what we call granulosa cells, and allows this to occur. So you can see this whole development here of the follicle, and there's a nice picture of it, so you can see that. Basically what happens is it may take about 150 days for a primordial follicle to become basically what's called a preantral follicle. And the oocyte becomes pressed to the one side of that follicle. You can see it. And it takes a while, and 70 more days becomes an antral follicle, and then 15 more days of development into a mature or Graafian follicle. That's what it's called. So there's a nice picture of a mature follicle that's ready to ovulate. All right. So you have about 20 primary follicles may begin maturing at a time. There will be one dominant follicle that usually outgrows the other. And typically, only the dominant follicle fully develops and the others degenerate. So again, it takes about 300 days, almost a year, to go from a primordial follicle into this mature follicle. This process is a continuous process, so that there is a new mature antral follicle ready for ovulation each menstrual cycle. So ovulation occurs very close to the end of this maturation. Again, the primary oocyte undergoes meiosis 1, produces a secondary oocyte, and the first polar body. And the process of ovulation is triggered by a surge in luteinizing hormone. And so the wall of the follicle swells, it weakens, it ruptures, and the secondary oocyte will be propelled to the opening near the fimbriae so that they can catch it. So that oocyte must be fertilized within about 12 hours or it degenerates. So that's why, people try, when's ovulation occurring if they want to get pregnant, because it's a small window. All right, so female sex hormones, again, we have the same thing as with the male. Development of the female sex characteristics, the maturation of the female sex cells, the changes in the menstrual cycle. The female sex hormones, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, again, causes the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH and LH, and then the FSH and LH control the maturation of the egg and the production of the female sex hormones. And again, luteinizing hormone, LH, a surge of it, causes ovulation. So your estrogens, a lot of this happens, it's going to stimulate the enlargement of the reproductive organs, thickening of the endometrium, development of the female secondary sex characteristics. Females also have progesterone, which stimulates the uterine changes during the menstrual cycle and affects the mammary glands. And we do have androgens secreted that cause the growth of the pubic hair and that kind of stuff. So looking at the menstrual cycle itself, this is a regular recurring changes in the endometrium of the uterus, which ends in menstrual bleeding. Begins around the age 13, continues until, somewhere in the early 50s. And you get these regular recurring changes in that endometrium. In the absence of fertilization, the oocyte degenerates and the corpus luteum degenerates and becomes corpus albicans, and it is sloughed. So let's kind of go through this. You have an ovarian phase and a uterine phase in terms of the menstrual cycle, and we're going to look at this, and maybe you can understand why some women get kind of, not so happy around when the period begins, okay? Feel full and that sort of thing. All right, so your ovarian phase, you have the follicular phase where that dominant follicle matures because of FSH. When the LH surges, that causes the final development of that follicle and the release of that oocyte. And then you have the luteal phase, what's left of that follicle, which is called the corpus luteum, forms and secretes estrogen and progesterone and what's called inhibin. And if fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum is kind of yellow. That's where the luteum comes from. And if fertilization does not occur, that degenerates into what's called the corpus albicans, which means white, and goes away. If pregnancy occurs, we'll talk about that next time, the next class, the corpus luteum remains and continues to produce estrogen and progesterone in order to maintain the pregnancy. You have the uterine phase, which is basically what you're trying to do is prepare, if you will, a nest for the egg, because the body is going to release this egg. It's going to assume fertilization is going to occur, and it's going to make a nest, a bed for this egg. All right, and if it's not fertilized, we slough that. We go make a new nest every month. So the uterine phase, first of all, is the proliferative phase where the endometrium is thickening due to estrogen. We want to get a nice thick nest or bed. The secretory phase, where basically the endometrium becomes more vascular. This is under the direction of progesterone, and the glands produce nutrients for the possible implantation of that fertilized egg. And then you have the menstrual phase, and that happens because the corpus luteum degenerates, the estrogen, the progesterone is not secreted, so those tissues die, that tissue dies, and that lining is sloughed. You actually have two layers, but that outer layer is sloughed, okay? All right, so you can look at these events, but you can see the increase in the lining, increase in lining, increase in lining. We're getting ready for a fertilized egg, and then we didn't get an implantation of a fertilized egg. We have degenerated from a corpus luteum, has degenerated into here, and we're not getting estrogen and progesterone produced, and we get a menstrual period. All right. This occurs until the female goes into menopause. And menopause, by definition, is when you don't have a menstrual cycle for 1 year. Again, usually somewhere in the late 40s, early 50s. The ovaries no longer produce as much estrogen and progesterone. Some of the secondary sex characteristics can disappear. You can get osteoporosis. About half the women experience hot flashes, headaches, backaches, that sort of thing. About, half the women basically have some issues in the menopause. All right, the breasts. Obviously, the whole idea is to secrete milk to nourish the baby following pregnancy. The mammary glands are located in the subcutaneous tissue within the breast. The mammary gland is composed of these lobes, and each lobe contains alveolar glands, which are drained by alveolar ducts, which drain into a lactoriferous, can I talk today, duct, which opens to the nipple. So the mammary glands of the male and the female are similar. It's just that, again, men have breasts. Men can get breast cancer. But when puberty is reached, the ovarian hormones stimulate the development of the mammary glands and the development into a breast that you see for the females. Breast cancer, very common, unfortunately. You may get warning signs of thickened tissue, a dimple, a change in contour, a nipple that flattens, discharge, something like that. Everybody is recommended for mammograms. There's all kinds of treatments, and they've gotten better with the treatments. They've gotten more specific with genetic treatment of that. So usually genetic testing will be done and to determine, what kind of factors are in that tumor and what they can treat it with. Birth control, voluntary regulation of the number of offspring. Basically, what we do is control some type of contraceptive, and we want to do contraception, and it can be several ways. I'll let you guys kind of go through this, obviously. You guys are adults, so you can go through this and take a look at this. Some of them are better than others. We can't get out of here without talking about sexually transmitted infections, STIs or STDs. Very common, unfortunately, and this is something we have to be careful of. When you take microbiology, they will be going into this more, and they will be going into the specific diseases. Pelvic inflammatory disease is one that I have to mention. It's associated with gonorrhea and chlamydia, and this can be scarring of the uterine tubes and result in infertility. So that can be a problem. So you can take a look at some of these. There's a lot of them that you may not think about, but again, you should be talking in micro about some of these. All right, so that's done, and we're going to go on to pregnancy.